I'm Cole. I'm a PhD candidate at Duke in the program Literature and in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. My paper should be about 15 minutes long. Nice to see everyone.
It's the perfect length of a paper. Megan, you're next on my screen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Jewell, and I'm English department faculty at Case Western Reserve University. Hi from sunny Cleveland. I'm excited to be here. Also, I have vertigo sometimes when looking at Zoom. So if I turn my camera off, it's not because I'm not engaged. It's just because it's kind of hard to hold my neck and do all of that kind of stuff. So, but I am looking forward to hearing your papers, and I am here. So.
Got it. Understood.
And my cat's going to do what yours is doing.
Yeah, he's my co-chair.
Okay.
Mary Helen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Helen. I'm a PhD student at the University of Denver. I'm in the poetry track. And what else? Oh, yeah, my paper should hopefully be about 15 minutes. Yeah.
So I'm Nathanael. I'm from New Zealand, currently living in Los Angeles, and I'll be starting a PhD this fall. And my paper will be sort of roughly 15 or 16 minutes, if that's okay.
And I'm Joshua Adams, and I teach at the University of Louisville, and I'm on the committee for the conference. And I was particularly interested in chairing this panel because all of the poets that were mentioned are poets I'm interested in. And a million years ago, I edited Chicago Review and published a whole bunch of these people in there. So anyway, okay. So Cole, I've got you on top of the list here, and so you can kick us off. And so let's give our papers, and then time for discussion afterwards.
So my dissertation at the broadest level is interested in the fate of poetry as a wounded object in post-war US literary studies and in the broader culture that readers and scholars remain invested in as an apparent outside to hermeneutics, totalizing thought, and institutionality itself. In the sites I focus on, the aesthetic experience of poetic writing seems to produce a simultaneously intoxicating and shameful escape from the devastation of contemporary life, from pervasive precarity, speed up, crisis ordinariness, and burnout. And insofar as poetics has been a metonym for expressive consciousness, aesthetic states, creativity, spirituality, and even freedom, poetics has often styled itself as a kind of untamed ground or an outside that generates solace, community, oppositionality, and even justice. Concurrently, in a moment of increasing skepticism over theory, right, theory with a capital T, literary and cultural studies scholars are returning to poetry for the precise reasons it was initially dismissed with the decline of the new criticism and the rise of theory in the 70s and 80s. Its minorness, its resistance to systematization, and its capacity for self-expression. And moreover, scholarships in fields and subfields across the critical humanities have increasingly turned towards poetics, descriptive writing, and experimental critical modes away from totalizing theorization, or this idea of total theory. And in these recent turns away from theory, or from an older kind of theory, poetics and poetry become the creative and innovative force that could energize both an exhausted disciplinary apparatus and the social ground it lays claim to. Now, in this paper I have here today, I turn to the work of Susan Howe, especially, and to a lesser extent in this paper, Rosemary Waldrop, I sort of just reference her for a moment, to consider how the language poets in particular mobilize the idea of poetic subordination as a means of linking themselves to contemporaneous debates about the possibilities of theory and the limits of the literary canon. And my focus here is really Howe's 1993 work of poetic criticism, The Birthmark, Unsettling the Wilderness in American Literary History. And in this paper, I use this idea of poetic subordination, which for me, that refers to the way that poetry has been posited as a sort of sanctuary from all of the various institutions and structures and kinds of thought that it enters into, which it sort of achieves by a sense of it being sort of subordinated, sort of the marginal kind of literary or aesthetic object. So sometimes poetry appears subordinate with respect to the novel, sometimes with respect to film, digital culture, or often, right, in the discourses of experimentalism, to sort of other kinds of poetry that are considered more dominant or hegemonic. And the language poets are especially concerned with this. And the institutional and formal coordinates of these sort of stories of poetic subordination, my dissertation it argues, they're sort of difficult to map objectively, right? This sort of subordination that poets and poetry scholars are often talking about maybe isn't, right, it can't be verified, right? It's more a feeling or an idea. And so instead, discourse on poetics that inaugurates itself with a claim to poetry's subordination seems to be indexing something about the experience of the object itself as a vehicle for subordination to a particular mode of writing, reading, or aesthetic scrutiny. So in this paper, I want to consider some places in Howe's work where poetry appears as this kind of sort of like non-systematic thought, right? That sort of sharpens systematic thought, right? And how describes that as poetry being like a kind of dream that one needs to have, right, before committing oneself to criticism or to critique. So here's a quote from a 1995 interview that Howe did with Charles Bernstein on this radio program. And this interview happened sort of right by this time. She's published by Emily Dickinson. She's published The Birthmark. And Bernstein asked her a question about those books, and Howe says, I was dealing with issues of power. It was very scary for me to be writing a book of criticism in the first place, so I was concerned with power. What is actual power? And that would sort of take me back to, as a child, World War II, that there's different kinds of power. And Dickinson went through, at the time of the Civil War, a tremendous conflict in her mind about assuming the power she knew obviously was in her, but that power isn't always good. Yes, women want power, but love has another power, and a power that's much harder to put into words. Now, as an older woman and a widow, I'm much more conflicted now when I speak about power in my own mind. Now, the main products of this critical hesitation that Howe's describing, the critical hesitation over Dickinson, right, that sort of plays out in these two very famous books by Emily Dickinson and the Bookmarks, books that would sort of cement Howe's status as, right, a preeminent experimental poet, but one with a complicated relationship to literary criticism itself, because Howe, as a poet, right, sort of her Poetics revolves around literary historical methods and sort of the institutional spaces of academia itself, as she puts it, to sort of fathom the wildness of expression in American literary history. And this very specific story that Howe wants to tell in these books about the kind of poetic subordination that would lead to, right, a sort of sense of shelter or escape through poetry, had to be very carefully articulated against a similar narrative that was being constructed in the contemporaneous recovery projects of feminist literary history, right? So Howe's work is always very concerned with feminist literary criticism, right, as a specific institutional site. And this scholarship, this feminist literary historical scholarship in the 70s and 80s, was at the sort of bleeding edge of the canon wars, which was a mobilizing effort, right, to sort of retrieve women writers from the dustbin of history as a means of authorizing a broader feminist critique of male domination and the feminist desire, right, to revalue women's unrecognized contributions to culture and society at large. And the sort of most famous architects, right, of this feminist literary historical project are Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, and they describe their goal as cultivating a distinctively female literary tradition, and for that cultivation to simultaneously perform and embody a kind of critique of patriarchy. I mean, one of the contentious issues here, right, that Howe's concerned with is that this project was effectively situated entirely within the academy. And by the end of the 80s, the import of this reality would set in academic feminist studies, right, that becomes increasingly concerned with its own institutional attachments, with pedagogy in the university as sites of unchecked power, and with the politics and ideology of theory itself. And so in this project that's begun in by Emily Dickinson and The Birthmark, Howe sought to correct the picture we thought we knew about Emily Dickinson, right, very famously. Howe was concerned with patriarchal authority over literary history and how that literary history had painted an image of Dickinson in her work that seemed to be at odds with Dickinson's own vision, right? Dickinson was painted to be less, right, sort of experimental than perhaps she'd previously been given credit for. According to Howe, Dickinson explored the implications of breaking the law. But sort of in my Emily Dickinson, right, there's this very famous moment where Howe actually sort of turns, right, and levels a critique at Gilbert and Gubar, right, the architects of this feminist literary history. And Howe dubs Gilbert and Gubar's work, right, as she puts it, a sorry illustration of the continuing vulgarization of the lives of poets, pandering to the popular sentiment that they're society's fools and madwomen. So a pretty crazy moment in that book. But here in this critique, the story that Howe wants to tell about poetry's subordination, right, isn't it only a means to kind of authorize her own project, right, but it's also right, a condition for a more robust feminism and a more robust feminist literary critical practice that would really do justice, right, to the lives and experiences of women. And in this story, right, feminist poetry, Howe's feminist poetry, but feminist poetry more generally, appears to be the thing that's outside of the institution, outside of the university, that allows us to interrogate troubling or perhaps even violent claims to truth and systematicity on the inside of feminist literary criticism. And in Howe's work, especially in The Birthmark, the way that this critique works is through identification, ventriloquism, and commentary, right, on all manner, right, of sort of early American literary figures. And in an early poem of Howe's, right, in the frame structures collected of her early works, right, there's a wonderful line, right, where Howe sort of encapsulates her own poetics, right, and she says, right, a pure past is it speakable, as sounds have paper-thin edges. Thus time dies and is not slain. See, deaf to us. So in the part of The Birthmark that's really interesting to me in my dissertation chapter, Howe is talking about Anne Bradstreet and her very famous poem, very highly anthologized, right? This poem is sort of seen as sort of a foundation for this sort of canonical idea of both American literary history, right, or women's writing. And this poem, the author to her book, right, it's often taken, right, as a sort of tongue-in-cheek statement of intellectual submission, right, or sort of an ironic statement by a woman writer in the 17th century, when, as Howe puts it, breaking Puritan sanctions against public statements, right, from her sex was a kind of revolution. And this very famous poem begins, thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. Right, so as Howe talks about in The Birthmark, this poem was unpublished in Bradstreet's lifetime. It was added to a collected edition of Bradstreet's work after her death. And so Howe reads this, right, as Bradstreet carefully controlling the tone of her rebellion so that she can sort of persist in her writing. So Bradstreet becomes a figure that allows Howe to also think through her own work, right, and sort of tell her own story of her poetics, right, and what she's trying to accomplish in her practice. But in many ways, Howe's project sits obliquely relative to similar work that's being undertaken by other language poets. And Howe's sort of interesting status relative to the language poets in this way is explored. There's a great book that was just published by Kimberly Andrews a year ago, right, called the Academic Avant-Garde. And there's a lot, I'm in dialogue with that book a lot here. But a sort of a book that's published at basically the same time as the book, as The Birthmark, is this book by Rosemary Waldrop, A Key into the Language of America, which is very formally similar, right? It takes Roger Williams' 1643 book of the same title, which is it's a sort of guide to Narragansett language. And for Waldrop, right, she sort of takes this guide and recollages it, right, sort of responds to it, translates it, and it becomes the basis for her own poems. But I'm really interested in this moment in the introduction to Waldrop's book, where she's sort of setting the stage for this project, right, where Waldrop describes her goal as, right, locating Indian subsoil or perhaps groundwater under the soil of American English. And Waldrop at the time was a Brown University professor who was living in that same Rhode Island. And sort of in this introduction, she starts with a sense of identification with Williams, right? She says, like Roger Williams, I'm ambivalent about my position among the privileged or the conquerors. And Waldrop sort of, right, sits with this identification and then pulls away, right? She asks, but am I among them? She says, right, although I'm white and educated, I'm also a poet and a woman. And a poet in our days is regarded as rather a marginal member of society whose social usefulness is in doubt. Right, so this is a very loaded, right, sort of comment to make, right? And sort of what allows Waldrop to sort of ponder, right, her relative distance from this, right, sort of history, right, is her apparently, right, subordinated status, right, as an experimental poet. And in this case, right, that sort of subordinated status, right, is sort of established by reference to or analogy with a racialized, right, or otherwise socially marginal position, right, this idea of poet as conquered. And it's this deployment of institutional or discursive position as a proxy for social position that's led scholars like Natalia Saussure to see language poetry as a white recovery project that reproduced the form of the feminist and multi-ethnic literary recovery projects that were happening concurrently. And in this case, right, through a discursively instantiated rather than an actual social antagonism, often articulated through the recovery of modernists like Stein and Zukofsky. But in the birthmark, I'm interested in asking, right, how Howe's sort of own recovery, right, is situated relative to these other language recovery projects. And I want to argue, right, that Howe's sort of hesitation doesn't come from a question about complicity or non-complicity in these histories, but rather from a question about, right, how to work with historical embeddedness as a sort of, right, inescapable fact, right? How is bound up in these histories that she's working with. And as Howe continues to tell Anne Bradstreet's story in the birthmark, I'm especially interested in this moment where this poetic sort of ill-formed offspring, right, Bradstreet's own poem, Howe actually reads it as a response to Mary Dyer, who was a woman in the 1630s involved in the antinomian controversy, right, a religious conflict, who eventually faced execution by hanging. And she gave birth, right, to a literal ill-formed offspring, right, a monstrous baby that sort of inflamed the imagination of Massachusetts Bay Puritans. And I'm not going to read this because I think I'm running low on time, but here we have a journal description, right, of this baby that's a monster. It has talons and horns and scales, and the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay are going crazy, and Howe excerpts this diary. But then we get another excerpt, right, from someone who gives an alternative testimony of this monstrous baby, a doctor in the Massachusetts Bay, who says, actually, that baby wasn't a monster, right? It was just, it was a stillborn, right? It was just bulb. It was flesh, right? It wasn't a monster. And I'm sort of interested in this sort of transition, right? And in the power, right, that both of these kinds of stories tell and the way how mobilizes them. I'm interested in how Howe is thinking about, right, how this sort of rumor, right, of the child's monstrosity had sort of already been disseminated, right, in this physician's testimony, right? It didn't sort of halt, right, all of these, right, this sort of upswell, right, of sort of furor and hysteria in the 17th century. But this story, right, it did have a real bearing, right, on stories that were being constructed about morality, gender, power, and belief, and the role of social institutions in political life. And right, to me, these sort of fantasies that dissolve under scrutiny sort of directly correlate to Howe's own theoretical introspection about the import and the ramifications of her own poetics. And so Dyer's monstrous offspring becomes a sort of vivid embodiment for Howe's own work. And I also, right, in my dissertation chapter, this is all very condensed, right, I read, right, this sort of monstrous offspring as an image for the broader work of poetic study in the wake of theory, right? Poetry as this sort of minor form, right, that if looked at through the wrong lens, right, it might turn out to be just lifeless bulbs of flesh. But actually sort of what gives poetry its power, right, in contemporary literary and cultural studies, is that, right, it's sort of like it can't be pinned down, right? Truth isn't what matters to poetry. And in my dissertation, I'm interested in thinking about other sites where these sorts of fantasies, right, of what poetry is or could do, regardless of whether poetry actually achieves those things, becomes, right, intellectually and politically maybe mobilizing. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is fascinating, and I already have a lot of questions for you. So just looking here at the roster, Mary Helen, you are next.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Cole. That was great. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. Oh, there's so many, yeah, thank you for that. There's so many interesting similarities and maybe slight contradictions between our work. So I'm excited to talk about that. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Mary Helen. I'm coming from the University of Denver. I am one of the poetry editors for the Denver Quarterly currently, and I've been working on an archival project on Laura Riding Jackson's Poetics. She published 4 essays in the Denver Quarterly between 1974 and 1975. And in those essays, she talks about her renunciation of poetry in 1941, soon after the publication of her Collected. So this archival project is looking at her letters to the editor at the time, Burton Feldman, as well as looking at these essays she published in the magazine. They're currently, the Denver Quarterly is still in print. So part of this project is hoping to get those original essays that she published housed online in some capacity as well, so they can be publicly accessible. And this is a quote from one of her essays from 1974, the second one she published. "If we put away our poems, we shall lose a beautiful unrealness that makes us feel we know what realness is." And I'll get more into that, but she is very adamant about poetry, poetry's relation to truth, and maybe less poetry, but more so language. I think that was the key distinction for her. And so she was born 1901, New York City, attended Cornell, and began publishing in 1923. Again, she renounced poetry in 1941, soon after the publication of her Collected. This is a photo of her in the Cornell Rare Books manuscript collection. And here's the quote she said, what she had to say for herself regarding her renunciation. "At the beginning of the 5th decade of my life, I withdrew from all literary associations, and especially from close working associations. I had maintained with a number of writers, to the good of whose own writing, and for the sake of a common human cause of comprehension of the good in language, I had very earnestly and hopefully devoted myself." She continues constantly to return to this idea of the good in language. I've gotten a real sense of her personality in working with all of her archival documents, and she was she had a lot of really strong convictions, so that's something that's going to come through in her work as well. And so this is a quote from this is the title of one of her most famous poems, "As Many Questions as Answers." In this essay I'm writing currently, I'm exploring her legacy in relation to how she's been constructed by theorists who came after her. So in Jan Hooving's essay, Laura Riding Jackson's Really New Poem, published in Gendered Modernism, Hooving calls Riding Jackson the first poet of new criticism. Yet Riding Jackson, in one of her essays in DQ, referred to new criticism as that pettifogging new criticism onto which various language analysis schools have endeavored to graft their theories, right? So her legacy has constantly been warped, and she's been repositioned into all these different categories as kind of indicative of a split between modernism and new modernism, or postmodernism, as a poet who kind of indicates the starting point of new criticism. All of these contradictions arise when you actually read her own work and what she had to say about herself. So it's been interesting to explore that, and in this kind of exploration, I'm hoping to just give her language the forefront in what it deserves. And going on her theories about new criticism, she says, "For language to be conceived of as a quantity other to literature in relation to it as a quantity, and grammar to be conceived of as a quantity other to language in relation to it as a quantity, something must have gone wrong or failed to go right in the total human quality." Again, she is writing at a time where I think she's criticizing certain breakdowns of language into these different faculties. She's also very kind of critical of the university of linguistics as a mode of engagement. So in the second essay she had published, What If Not a Poem Poems, where she really starts to talk about her ideas about truth, this is one of the things she says about poetry. She's very bothered by poetry's kind of nature as artifice, right? And that's going to come into play when we're thinking about what she means for the language poets. In poetry, there is no forward movement. The potential of movement is dissipated in the use of words to produce the sensory effective movement. The poet may strain to make the art of producing the effect and the reality of movement somehow partners, but the poem must be a poem and not a progress. The successful poem transports you into itself, yet when you have come to the end of the poem, you have gone nowhere. She's highly critical of the sensory effect that poetry can have, which I'm particularly interested. I've been reading recently about neuroscience studies about sound and onicity. When words sound like what they mean, the lexical processing is literally more fluid and it increases aesthetic pleasure. And she's very, very kind of wary about this nature, this capacity for poetry in its sensory effect to maybe produce knowledge. Again, there's many things in her work that I am, that I push up again in my own poetics, but how she's been historicized is particularly interesting to me. So she's been kind of written into this, indicating this split between modernism and postmodernism, as well as kind of the locus out of which the language school developed. In his essay, Reading Renunciation, Lore Writing and the End of Poetry, Tom Fisher explores the legacy of writing's renunciation. He acknowledges the way her renunciation has been read as reflecting the split between modernism and postmodernism, and out of which the language-centered writing of the 80s emerged. The impetus for what Jerome McGann, who he's in conversation with, called the rethinking of poetic truth as a linguistic and social experience and event rather than an epistemological or imaginative category. So Fisher agrees with Ashton, another theorist he's working with, who stated that language poets sought to claim writing as their precursor, have founded their poetics on doing exactly what she vehemently refused. So I'm looking into how exactly that happened, considering she's written a lot of critical work about her poetics, and yet the language poets pick her up and kind of use her for completely different purposes. And I wonder if that has something to do with some of the inaccessibility of some of her critical work. I'm not sure exactly, but I'm still kind of teasing out what that might entail. And then in Reading Renunciation, this is the larger quote that Fisher has to say. I think the main point here is that she is seen as emphasizing this kind of debasement of craft, right, in her turn away from poetry, and that is kind of what the Fisher has been criticizing about her. If, as Ashton said, the language poets start where writing stops, thinking their projects together is not an egregious critical error, but a potentially productive and provocative reading practice that can show us something about the poetic methods and assumptions of each, right? So what might this productive reading together look like, right? In this essay, Fisher poses that as a possibility, but he doesn't exactly do that work of reading the language poets right up next to writing Jackson. So that's what I'm trying to do in this essay, particularly looking at Heginian's essay, The Rejection of Closure, and then what writing Jackson has said about her own poetics, her own sense of poetry as always producing the effect of completeness. And that's something she writes about in these Denver Quarterly essays. Yeah, and how can we, I'm interested in thinking about, in doing this work, right? How can we position writing's work outside of this negative valence where she's seen as someone who's just writing about the debasement of craft, and rather talking about maybe her own conception, right? What she said about herself was that she was prioritizing the good in language constantly, right? And this breakdown of language into various fields seemed to be doing something to the nature of language itself, right? And so she's more interested in the good, and then in the historicizing of her, she's often caught in negative valence. Okay, and then so in this kind of close reading between Heginian and writing, I'm looking at, you know, the rejection of closure, which was first given as a talk in San Francisco in 1983. Heginian says in that essay, again, this is one of the most kind of seminal creative writing 101 essays at this point. I think this is what you teach your students in you know, Poetry 1. So I'm also interested in how this has really captured the contemporary poetic imagination. So Heginian said, language discovers what one might know, which in turn is always less than what language might say. We encounter some limitations of this relationship early as children, discover that words are not equal to the world, that a blur of displacement, a type of parallax, exists in the relation between things and the words for them. So yeah, I'm kind of posing that question, right? What do words equal the world, right? In writings kind of formulation, they do. She believes that language is adequate, and then the artifice of poetry is maybe what's failed, right? This constant effect of completeness. Again, I won't read this. She has so many kind of wonderful quotes and so many lines that you could pull from her essays about her thoughts on poetry. An arbitrary postulate that there is an inexpressible, and all its devices are designed for the suggestion of the inexpressible, postulated expressible as good as expressed. So I won't read all that for the sake of time. Is the inexpressible then really as good as the expressed, right? I think that's the key question here. And this seems to be the dividing kind of ontological difference between someone like Heginian, the language poets, maybe, and then writing Jackson, who they claim to have kind of grown out of. And while Heginian seems to accept, right, with the child noticing the world, there's something not equal to the world, that there is something not there, that's an essential aspect of language. Writing sees that not there-ness as a failure particular only to poetry, right? Not to language inherent, not to inherent to language as such. If we take seriously this kind of alternate ontology predicated on language's adequacy, what does it do for poetry, right? How might we read the language poets in that lens? How might we think about the kind of desire for some kind of totalizing theory that maybe Cole's talking about? So what do we do with this kind of split? Or is it just kind of a fact of the history between these two thinkers? How might a reconsideration of Laura Riding Jackson's Poetics, as written by her in her own words, rethink the rethinking of poetic truth, right? That Fisher talks about. So in tracing that ontology, kind of, I've been finding theorists to kind of fall into line with this idea of language's adequacy, right? You have Walter Benjamin's earliest essay from 1916, I think fits into this kind of conception on language as such and the language of man. He says that, you know, all of what is conceivable is communicable in language, right? That the mental being is identical with linguistic being. And this has there's a robust history of this in philosophy. Benjamin is not the only one. But it is interesting to me that this is his first, one of his first essays, right? One of his really early work came out of this kind of consideration, that the mental being, what is conceivable, is communicable, right? That the two would be absolutely inextricable. Another person who is kind of in line with this theory is Kristeva. In From One Identity to Another, she talks about the impossibility of separating the semiotic and the semantic, essentially, right? That the semiotic is always preparing this the speaker for the entrance into meaning. It would be impossible to separate the two. There's another quote that Laura Riding Jackson had about her own poem, right? In these essays in the Denver Quarterly, she's highly critical of her own work. She's doing close readings of her own poems to find out where they failed. One of the endings of one of her paragraphs that is particularly great ends with, "What is this but an epilogue to extinction? Why did I give up so easily?" Right? That's what she has to say about her own work. again, she's a poet with a lot of conviction. I do admire it. And I really love her poetry. So it is hard for me to, dive into her thinking and see, wow, she really didn't, she moved beyond thinking that poetry was useful. So for me, I'm like, well, I still just really simply love her poems. So following, this idea of the mental entity as existing in language, there seems to be a problem of preposition, possibly, right? In rather than through. How are we communicating? Hegelian construction might posit that language is something expressed through rather than in. Again, that's just a possibility. But either way, in this change of preposition, a loss of capability seems to occur. And for writing Jackson, in postulating an inexpressible, that denied the very essence of language as constituting what mental being might be. And do children actually discover that there's a parallax between the things in the world and the words for them? I'm not sure. That would take me into early childhood language acquisition studies, which I haven't done yet, but I am curious about that question. I feel like it's something that is taken kind of on face value at this point, and I'm not sure we've really actually dug into what the ramifications are. And Fisher's thinking about this split between the two as this ultimate impediment. I've hoped to do in this essay a kind of productive thinking together of the projects between the language poets and writing Jackson, and hopefully in reanimating her ideas in the present, I hope to confuse, at the very least, the kind of clear binary assumption that her poetry marked a split between modernism and postmodernism, and that between language poetry and whatever came before. And maybe just kind of revisit this idea of poetic truth, either being linguistic and social experience or epistemological and imaginative category. I think we can, I think there's room to pull those groupings apart. And these are some of the notes from her archive that I'm working with, her actual documents. So this has been one of the most intense challenges of working with the archive, is the actual material. Her handwriting is at times completely indecipherable. So that has been something that I have struggled with. This is my first kind of real work that I've done in an archive, and it's challenging. I know Susan Howe, I was happy to see that you were presenting on Susan Howe, because I was like, oh, this seems very much in line. But yeah, just the difficulty of the material itself can be something. I do really like how I can only make on this word, it's just like silence. So I thought that was one of these kind of beautiful poetic moments. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mary Helen. Okay, next we've got Megan.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see if I can. Also, I did not make a presentation, so I will try not to read lengthy quotes. In the meantime, while you're listening to me, if I do have to read lengthy quotations, then you can just look at these beautiful handkerchief poems and tune me out. Okay, so I was originally, going to focus on DuPlessis' graphic novella, and which is another collage work of hers. But today I'm going to focus instead on the notion of blended subjectivity and feminist collectivity in Life in Handkerchiefs. And that's her book of collage poems from 2017. More specifically, I'm going to focus on DuPlessis' engagement with sentimental ideas and tropes that appear in this work. And I will still be addressing to some extent issues of feminist collectivity in the collage form generally here. Life in Handkerchiefs is published in 2017, and it's a 61-page, pardon me, collage poem. The artist's description indicates that it's 8 by 11, it's letter size, and so hefty enough for collage. It's made of fabric, lace, artificial flower trimmings, so you can see vintage handkerchief, string paper. I don't know if I scroll, can you see here's another one. Okay. There we are. And then I'll just move on. Okay. Okay. DuPlessis writes that it's loosely a progress through life with an emphasis on the female life, as you can probably see, especially giving the suggestiveness of hankies as a charming old accessory that is a little old-fashioned. Okay. DuPlessis also acknowledges the loose allusion to Heginian's poetic autobiography, My Life, also a serial poem, that innovatively explores the tension. In the artist note, importantly, DuPlessis also notices the communal, personal, and serendipitous, we have Susan Howe here, process of composition. She said she put out a little call and got random responses from friends and acquaintances and was quite pleased to have some more things and bits of the medium, hankies, to choose from. And she decided to use at least one scrap from every person who has donated any hanky materials to the project. And she did, and she notes that this is very like her 1979 essay for the Etruscans, in which I had tried a collective authorship in a modified way, using every citation and response that people in a seminar sent to her. So she's been doing the collage practices, and they're all pretty much coherent and systematic for a long time now. The handkerchiefs are not only mixed material extensions of notes for the Etruscans, but also can be compared to those extensive notes in some of the poems in Drafts, which is her multi-volume long poem, her life poem, which she concluded, I think in 2015. These notes often acknowledge in a collaborative spirit others' ideas, and they are textual acknowledgments representative of collaboration. In this sense, the handkerchiefs in this volume are uber material representations of collaborative production, but they are also things that outlast themselves, as she writes in the first volume. She also writes in the first volume that while words are pulverized dust, endlessly scattered, the hankies remain. And I'm going to put this up here so you can kind of look at that first poem. They are, as she explains, quoting Adorno, blind spots that have escaped the dialectic, elements that perhaps, according to their effective and feminine associations, evade or exceed dominant exchange value narratives. As DuPlessis writes in the first poem, thus poetry might better submerge into a theory of debris or hankies, or perhaps simply become the debris as hanky. So in my essay, I see this material positioning of textual collaboration and citation with a particularly ultra-feminine form of the hanky as shedding much light on the effective and communal nature of DuPlessis' collage. Hankies are indeed extremely feminine. And as DuPlessis writes, her book of poem composed of them is, quote, really our lives, times, and gender, mainly female. She acknowledges, though, that, quote, men still do use handkerchiefs, of course, but there is a particular odd charm to all the femme hankies we used to have, get gift boxes of, and use every day for special pretty occasions. She also writes, though, of the dual nature of the feminine and her invocation of the feminine when she notes that, the work is compounded of, sorry about the long quotes, a sense of talismans. People like me had saved them for years. And loss, decay, rips, holes, wornness, and the wonder of the pretty. Why not have a pretty flower embroidered in your life, she asks, while also blood, mucus, and dirt may gather on them. She asks, is this the work where I come to terms with and forgive the feminine? Here, which she's had an ambivalent relationship with all of her life. So in my reading today, which I, again, will try to limit in the face of excess here. In my reading, I see DuPlessis' ambivalence to the feminine, specifically coming through this configuration of hanky to debris. I therefore view the hanky as both an allusion and an oppositional reclamation of, or rather a thinking through of the sentimental poetic tradition, one that is represented by keepsakes such as the hanky, and pre-modern poetesses who incorporated keepsake and keepsake sentiment and language into their work, and from which the tradition of modern and postmodern women writers cannot be completely separated. As Suzanne Clark writes, the sentimental has a strange existence as a discourse with its coherence defined by opprobrium, right? The sentimental, right, is just an insult. It is the feminized other discourse, which functions like a woman itself to make the binary definition with the sentimental versus modern possible. So in this literary, historical, and cultural configuration, the private discourse of feeling and public community of women, guardians of feeling, are both under modernism sentimental. Yet, as Clark points out, modernist writers called upon these established traditions by women that appeal to the feeling, their loyalties to the new woman, their desire for progress, their allegiance to the maternal and comforting forms. But these women also participated in the revolution of the word. They're the both and, as DuPlessis would put it. And put another way, as innovative as they were, women poets of modernism still needed an established literary tradition that many were not quite ready to dismiss. Their ambivalence perhaps resembles the same feeling expressed in Life in Handkerchiefs. So, for instance, if you saw this poem, if you were looking at it, would you think that it was a modern poem? One of my students recently said it had a live, life, laugh vibe to it. So I don't know if that, I would agree. But it definitely has this keepsake element. So what I'm looking at here is DuPlessis' engagement with the tradition of the poetess. And I'm going to go through Marianne Moore, time permitting, because that's where I see it manifesting mostly. DuPlessis has written extensively on Moore. But the poetess is a quite controversial figure. She's again, kind of the sentimental woman with three names, right? Who sort of has a holier than thou attitude. As poet Annie Finch, who has written an extensive defense of the poetess, even calling herself a postmodern one, asks, what image of poetic endeavor is now most universally despised? The consumptive man in his garret? The dilettante heiress who supports other writers, the hermit spinster? The prosperous professional who writes on the side? No, it's the woman with three names who muses piously on love, bowers, and the deaths of mothers and babies. That's clearly it, the sentimental one. Some of these names include Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Frances Sargent Osgood, Lydia Sigourney Huntley Sigourney, sorry, and many other mistresses or Mrs. MRSs. As modern poet Louise Bogan recognized, sentimental women writers made an important contribution to poetics, and modernist women poets needed, as Bogan wrote, a tradition to, quote, share with men the need for some sort of civilized ground from which to draw sustenance. Indeed, poets such as Dickinson, Teasdale, those were the ones sort of led into the modernist canon. But later, Millay, Moore, Stein, Amy Lowe, Eleanor Wiley, Mina Loy, they were all women working to define a new kind of writing, a writing which might unsettle the terms of the cultural gendering which oppressed them, but they formulated new definitions that merely unsettled and did not rest wholesale on the modernist masculinist dismissal, as it were, of a creative tradition in which women at this time had some actual creative and public autonomy, right? Like Bradstreet. So Sigourney, also known as the sweet singer of Hartford, for example, in what we would currently call a brilliant maneuver in branding, was paid the equivalent of $20,000 in today's money by Godey's Ladies Book for permission just to list her name on the masthead. In this light, DuPlessis' Life in Handkerchiefs, with its strong note of feminine sensibility and community, is what we might call a feminist reclamation of the material conditions in which modernist women poets, and as you know, DuPlessis is a writer of probably more than 20 books of criticism, and helped to establish the field of modernist women writers scholarship. So DuPlessis' book, with its strong nod to this traditional feminine sensibility and community, is what we might call a postmodern reclamation of the material conditions in which modernist women poets created their art, and it spans more than a century. How am I doing on time? Like 5 minutes or so? Okay, I should have looked. So as I mentioned, I see in Moore's, and I'm not going to go through it because it's kind of technical. I see in Life in Handkerchiefs a clear homage to Marianne Moore, and Moore's dismissal of Pound's wholesale rejection of the excessive, dumpy, hoarder, sentimental feminist poem, and his the poem Portrait du Femme, Portrait of it, yeah. So at any rate, keep going here, let's see. What DuPlessis says is that in Moore's poem, The Monkeys, if any of you have read that, what Moore does is, there are many more engagements, which I will get to later, is obliquely comment on Pound's rejection of what I like to call discourses of alterity. Okay, so Pound is in his portrait of a woman, he is dismissing the deposits of debris that he sees as represented by these sort of feminine literary traditions. As we all know, Pound was all about stripping all of excess verbiage, feminized verbiage from writing. Moore is dismissing in DuPlessis' readings Pound's exclusion of a heterogeneous high and low bow poetic production and what DuPlessis interprets as Pound's exclamatory condescension to the woman depicted for her centerless accumulation of flotsam and jetsam. While there are numerous and perhaps also Freudian complications in Pound's poem regarding gender and creativity in excess, and while more could certainly be said about the Poundian thrust to make it new at the expense of an utterly feminized old, it is clear that DuPlessis reads in Moore a critique of Pound's dismissal of the feminine tradition in The Monkeys. She also does this by engaging in what Finch might call these blended subjectivities, or rejecting the lyric and speaking from a bifurcated voice that acknowledges difference. And this is a very innovative technique. Again, though it could be traced back to the sentimental women poets who also rejected who also engaged in blended or bifurcated subjectivities. Now, they were doing it, as is Moore, and suspect to some extent, in rejection of the lyric, right? The romantic lyric, a position that they did not have access to. Both as bourgeois women poets of the home, they could not adopt that romantic lyric stance, but also we have to remember that the women didn't really fully have legal rights at this time either. So to kind of speak from that position of the romantic lyric poet was very untenable to them. But still, we can see in their blended subjectivities a particularly communal gesture that, again, calls into question this notion of masculinist lyric subjectivity. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick reading of this poem and then end. I'm going to read this very briefly as a keepsake, a sentimental keepsake. And as the materiality of these poems turns them into keepsakes. As critic Joanne Dobson, who first identified the trope, explains, she identified it mostly in sentimental novels. The keepsake is an effective sentimental element primarily used to convey emotion. It's a bracelet made by a child, a lock of hair. It has little to no exchange value, and its primary worth is in remembrance. It can show up also in colloquial forms of language or informal inside jokes. Not unlike the kind I've been using here to lighten the mood, but it creates a shared community at any rate. While herself self-reflexively speculating on the form of the handkerchief, DuPlessis in the first poem writes about its many commemorative forms, as well as its fabric brother, so to speak, the bandana. She writes that soldiers were once given bandanas imprinted with maps, thus carrying information about their way. They were lost inside territory. It's not quite as effective here and more useful in a masculine and aggressive context of war. The material object of fabric or cloth has a use in what is next DuPlessis' self-reflexive democratic exploration of their value. She continues, they commemorate monuments of exotic destinations in capital cities or islands with happy people bounding and playing, or the tiny sweetness of a location, girlhood. It's interesting that she compares girlhood to a place here. And so the stanza ends with this expansive interrogation of our median and the colon preceding and thus emphasizing girlhood, seeming to sum it all up. The hanky is sweetly located in the place or province of the feminine. I came across a really interesting article called Cloth, Gender, and Politics by a writer named Louise Perbrick that analyzes the gendered political meaning of an IRA handkerchief, Irish Republican Army handkerchief decorated by the women members of it who were imprisoned in the Armagh jail in Northern Ireland in 1976. The Armagh handkerchief represents a contradictory and borrowed form, but one in which the gendered properties of the handkerchief or cloth persist. 45 women signed it with just a cheap ballpoint pen. And as Herbrick writes, the fabric is weighed down with significance with all of the name, Angela, Anne, Brenda, Dolores, and so on, continuing to the end of the alphabet. She asks, how can its fragile materiality contain such force? And for those who are scholars of DuPlessis, she frequently will repeat the word force to represent not only in homage to George Oppen, but her own creative impulses. And she'll do this in across her body of work. So I might ask the same in terms of this collage poem, Life in Handkerchiefs. When considering the materiality of cloth in this volume, might we well look beyond its delicacy, but to its well-concealed strength and invocation of the politics of women writing and the force of such collective poetic expression.
So thanks, everyone. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the talks so far. Today, I'm going to be sharing some provisional thoughts about simplicity in the notoriously difficult poetry of the so-called late modernist British poet J.H. Prynne. I'm going to think about why pinpointing the source of Prynne's difficulty is itself a difficult question. And I'm going to suggest why it might be worthwhile for the readers of Prynne's difficult poetry to also consider its moments of relatively frictionless simplicity. And now I'm going to begin. Beginnings are often hard. J.H. Prynne has disavowed his debut collection of poetry, Force of Circumstance and Other Poems, and the first line of the poem that begins his collected poems ends with the word difficult. I struggled for some time over how to begin this talk, but I was rescued by the fact that my theme here today is simplicity, and so it is perhaps appropriate to begin on a simple note with the truism. J.H. Prynne is a difficult poet. Before proceeding any further, I want to supply some biographical context for those of you who are unfamiliar with Prynne's work. It's very much in the spirit of what's to come in this talk that providing detailed information about Prynne's life is a simple task, simple because it is very difficult and thus arguably futile. With the notable exception of an interview published in the fall 2016 issue of the Paris Review, Prynne displays no interest in constructing a public persona, rarely reads his poetry in public, and appears to be unmotivated by the trappings of literary celebrity. In Prynne's work, as Prynne himself writes, quote, there is a well-attested distaste for self-promotion or any kind of personality interest attaching to the writer as the performing origin of the text, end quote. Despite this well-attested distaste for self-promotion, or perhaps because of it, insofar as few decisions arouse public interest so much as self-imposed privacy, the basic facts of Prynne's life are well known. Born in Kent, England in 1936, Prynne was educated at Cambridge University, where he subsequently returned after a brief period at Harvard to commence a career as a teacher and librarian at Gonville and Caius College. After a 6-year interim between the disavowed Force of Circumstance and Prynne's second/first collection Kitchen Poems published in 1968, Prynne has published a staggering amount of collections, mostly in small print runs with independent publishers, some of which you can see here on my screen. In addition to his poetry, Prynne has published critical prose on an eclectic variety of topics. He has also published commentaries on individual poems by poets such as George Herbert and William Wordsworth, commentaries that push close reading to its limits by detailing the linguistic and literary history of individual words with an overwhelming degree of zealous attention. In his commentary on Shakespeare's 94th sonnet, for example, Prynne spends 3 pages on the pronoun they, marshalling evidence from Thomas Wyatt to Philip Sidney in an attempt to establish how the word they functioned in the 16th century and how those functions open or close certain semantic possibilities in the sonnet. Joshua Coden has read these commentaries as a kind of implicit criticism of contemporary scholarship for its lack of philological rigor. And regardless of whether we accept Coden's reading, it is not easy to come away from Prynne's critical prose with an intact complacency about the fundamental simplicity of literary criticism. Okay, so I think that's enough kind of biographical context for us to move on. So we've established that Prynne is a poet, but you'll recall that the truism that I used as a launchpad previously stated that Prynne isn't any old poet, but is a difficult poet. So why is Prynne difficult, and what might it mean to be a difficult poet? The obvious irony often invoked in discussions of literary complexity, which I myself am certainly not above using here as a kind of proleptic apology, is that difficulty is itself difficult to define. And we can see this meta difficulty at work in the frequently circular discussions of Prynne's difficulty. I say circular because such discussions often begin with the obligatory observation that Prynne is a difficult poet, followed by a series of examples of his difficulty. Often, however, these examples are suspended in midair by the assumption that their intrinsic difficulty needs no supporting justification. Consequently, the concept of difficulty appears much more unitary than it actually is. We're not asked, for example, to grapple with questions about the relativity of difficulty, with how what is difficult for me might be simple for you, for whatever contingent reasons of education, background, or sociolinguistic heritage. And in relation to Prynne, we're left with the circular conclusion that Prynne is a difficult poet because his poems are difficult, because he writes about difficult topics, which leaves us in a position that I think is most eloquently captured by this GIF. As an example of this circularity, I want to adduce Kirsten Sutherland's claim that Prynne's poetry of the 1960s is as intellectually ambitious as Milton's of the 1660s. Prynne set out in Kitchen Poems and The Whitestones a prospectus for philosophic song so astronomically demanding that Menelaus might have shrunk from it in trepidation. Sutherland partially justifies his claim that Prynne's early poetry is astronomically demanding by listing the resources that this poetry would proceed to make use of. Sutherland writes, for example, that, quote, phenomenology from its beginnings in Occam and the scholastics to the present day would be reinterpreted as the moralism of immediate knowledge. Morphology, lexicology, and etymology would become component parts of the technique of a lyric poetry that learned from and outstripped Heidegger's restitution to philosophy of the archaic meanings of basic concepts. Modern science would be studied and learned in detail, and all data, no matter how vanishingly hypermodern, hypothetical, or arcane, brought under the central command of a hermeneutics of our latent existential possibility, end quote. Sutherland, who is himself a difficult poet, is difficult here in this passage. I don't, for example, quite know what he means when he writes that Prynne's poetry reinterprets phenomenology as the moralism of immediate knowledge, and I'm also unsure what a hermeneutics of our latent existential possibility would look like. Perhaps exactly this kind of difficulty is required when one is writing about a difficult poet, so that the form of one's writing mirrors or complements its content. But in any case, this passage typifies the kind of circularity I was just talking about. We're told that Prynne is a demanding poet, and this claim is reinforced with a series of thinkers or bodies of knowledge that are themselves famously demanding, such as Heidegger, the scholastics, and modern science. But if we set aside the important intellectual history that this passage is excavating, and we assess it purely on the basis of what it tells us about how or why Prynne is a demanding poet, then we're still left in the dark. We've only been told that Prynne is a demanding poet who writes about or whose writing is informed by demanding areas of thought. And that is almost a tautology. So where does that leave us if we want to clarify poetic difficulty? As it happens, J.H. Prynne himself has written on the topic. This presents us with yet another difficulty, which I won't go into too deeply, but would like to have hovering in the background as we go on. And that is the difficult question of how we should evaluate discussions of a poet if the terms of that discussion have been significantly affected or shaped, by the poet's own critical or theoretical writing. Prynne's prose writings have been preoccupied with difficulty at both poles of his career. In 1961, for example, Prynne published a short essay titled Resistance and Difficulty in the little magazine Prospect. And in a keynote speech at a 2008 conference in China, later published as Difficulties in the Translation of Difficult Poems in the Cambridge Literary Review in 2010, Prynne offers a number of thoughts about poetic difficulty as viewed through the lens of translation. Prynne observes that one of the difficulties with difficulty is that it can refer to both linguistic and non-linguistic features, which can lead to a complicated intermingling of simplicity and difficulty. Prynne mentions, by way of example, that certain poems by William Blake and Emily Dickinson express profound and difficult thoughts in a language of relative simplicity. In contrast, Prynne notes, sometimes Tennyson expresses simple thoughts in, quote, elaborately subtle language, end quote. In order to ameliorate these problems with distinguishing between different levels or aspects of difficulty, Prynne chooses to focus on linguistic difficulty as opposed to difficulty of thought. It should come as no surprise that Prynne does not offer a bite-sized definition of linguistic difficulty laid out for the reader to choose, swallow, and digest at their convenience, but we can infer a general outline of his relationship to linguistic difficulty. Prynne writes, for instance, that poetic difficulty is often linked to language that is, quote, unusually cross-linked or fragmented, dense with response patterns that challenge the reader's powers of recognition, end quote. We can hear the word cognition and recognition, which perhaps shows the futility of trying to erect a non-fuzzy division between difficult language and difficult thought. But we can nonetheless observe that for Prynne, linguistic difficulty is connected to nonlinear, cross-linked language. And indeed, he elsewhere writes that difficult poetry is, quote, like a network across the whole expanse of the text, with many loops and cross-links of semantic and referring activity, which extends the boundaries of relevance and of control by context in many directions at once. If these directions develop so as to produce strong contradiction and self-dispute, then the method may become a dialectic practice in which poetic form and expression are brought into internal contest with themselves and with each other. In concluding this presentation, I want to focus on Prynne's reference to poetic difficulty as a dialectical practice. For readers of Prynne, it's not surprising that he would conceptualize poetic difficulty dialectically. In his Paris Review interview, for example, Prynne writes that, quote, contradiction and oppositional thinking has to find a way to juggle terms so that the mood quality and the emotional and moral tonalities involved maintain their power without becoming oppressively single-minded. Single-mindedness is no good to a poet, end quote. If single-mindedness is no good to a poet, we might also suggest that it is no good to critics and scholars of poetry. And that brings me to the final point that I want to raise today. Difficulty is a perennial concern and subject in critical studies of Prynne's poetry. Yet Prynne's Paris Review interview, in which the word dialectic appears some 9 times, shows him to be deeply interested in the movement and trade between opposing ends of conceptual continuums. One potentially valuable line of approach to Prynne's work, then, which is the antithesis of the dominant critical mode, would be to explore the simple or simpler aspects of Prynne's oeuvre. Instead of thinking about poems like this one from the 2014 collection Al Dente, or this poem by Prynne in classical Chinese, or this poem by Prynne in Old English runes, we might pay more attention to poems like Voll Verstein's. Sorry for my appalling German accent there. How might we read Voll Verstein's? The general algorithm when reading a Prynne poem is to construe its ambiguous grammar, identify the different vocabularies at play, research the etymologies of words that fall at especially significant junctures, and consult Google for intertextual allusions. On the face of it, the straightforward syntax and clear language of Voll Versteinst does not demand that kind of detective work. What kind of work does it demand? I'm not entirely sure. When reading this poem, I find myself in the unusual position of being baffled by simplicity, which raises an interesting irony I want to end on, which is that we, as literary critics, have various tools that we can use to help us read difficult literature, such as the guidebooks that purport to explain mythological references, or the concepts like defamiliarization that theorists have elaborated to explain the fascination of what's difficult. In contrast, we have comparatively few tools to help us read simple texts. Perhaps that's simply because simple texts do not pose the kinds of questions that obligate readers to look for outside assistance. But if for the moment we entertain the idea that simple literary objects can pose difficult or even intractable interpretive problems, then we are left with the counterintuitive irony that difficult texts are simple to read and simple texts are difficult to read, at least when viewed from the perspective of interpretive assistance. In relation to both the study of Prynne and of poetics more generally, the difficulty of simplicity and vice versa might be a topic worthy of further consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathanael, and to all of our panelists. Those were all very rich presentations.